I would like to welcome on the stage participants of this panel. I guess it's very nice that we will continue. Not this one. I'm very happy that we will continue with the topic that we had from our keynote speaker, Magdalena Grobowska. So panel 2, learning from her stories, research on socialist women's and gender politics. And here today we have Agnieszka Mrozik. She is an assistant professor at the Institute of Literary Research of the Polish Academy of Sciences. She is affiliated with 2 research teams in the Center of Cultural and Literary Studies on Communism and the Archives of Women. She holds a PhD in Literary Studies and an MA in American Studies. She has recently co-authored and co-edited the volume Historical Memory of Central and East European Communism. She is currently working on a book project entitled Forgotten Revolution, Communist Female Intellectuals and the Making of Women's Emancipation in the Post-War Poland. Also, after Agnieszka, we will have Alexandra Delaware. She is a PhD candidate in gender studies at Central European University, Budapest. Her research project is Women Should Be Given the Right to Decide for Themselves, the role of the Soviet Women's Committee in gender policy making in the Soviet Union. It aims to revise the history of the post-war Soviet gender politics through a focus on, first, the agency of Soviet Women's Committee members within Soviet policy-making structures. Second, on the ways in which Soviet scholarship and participants in policy debates conceptualized women's interests. Previous education, MA in Gender Studies, and MA in Cultural Studies. And Agnia Bagdžiūnaitė, my comrade, holds a master's degree in gender studies in Central European University Budapest and in political science in Vytautas Magnus University Kaunas. She is also a part of the left media platform Gyvenimas per brangus, or Life is Too Dear, and a member of May 1st Trade Unions Council. Her research interests include women's struggles in Soviet Union and the theory of critical feminism, social reproduction theory, intersectional gender studies, theory and history of social movements. She is currently collaborating in the ethnographic research project Untold Independent Stories, Closing Alytus Textile Factory. And now I will give a floor for Agnieszka, who will give a talk, Female Architects of the Polish People's Republic, the case of Zofia Dembińska as a critical contribution to the feminist theory and biographical writing in Poland.
Thank you very much. Thank you for invitation. I don't feel very well today. I have problems with hearing. So if you will be asking any questions to me, please speak loud. Okay, thank you for this introduction. Today I will be talking about Zofia Dembińska. This name appeared before in Magda's presentation. And my research on Dembińska is part of my broader research on Polish communist women, active mainly in the field of culture, education, and science, who after the Second World War work for the project of women's emancipation. My work combines research on the history of women's movement in its leftist faction, biographical perspective, critical analysis of texts and discourses, with a reflection on contemporary memory and the production of knowledge about the past. So I'm particularly interested in feminist theory and biographical practice in Poland, and these either ignore post-war communist women or recall them with a number of reservations. And among these reservations, one of the dominant ones is denying the communist women the emancipatory feminist dimension of their actions. And one important remark at the beginning, whom do I call communist women? I call communist women women who identify themselves as communist. I mean, who were either because in a common language we say, oh, this was a communist time, and everything what happened in post-war period was a communist. It's simply not true. We, as the scholars of this topic, we know that as it is presented in Marxist theories, there was no communism in post-war Europe. It was no communism in post-war Poland. However, they were there were communist parties, there were communist declarations of views, of programs, and there were also people who identify themselves as communist activists or politicians. And in Poland, it's important because especially in the pre-war period, we had a socialist party and a communist party. So the distinction here matters. So by communist women, I call those women who identify themselves as communists. So I thought about this feminist theory and a biographical practice and why communist women are not present, they are not often examined. So I thought about this aspect particularly intensive last year. And the last year, 2018, was called by the Polish Parliament the Year of Women's Rights. And the impulse was the 100th anniversary of granting Polish women the right to vote, which was commemorated in the official and state fields, as well as through non-governmental initiatives, including those undertaken by feminist academics, artists, and activists. So I was struck that although the phrase Year of Women's Rights is much broader than the Year of Women's Suffrage, feminist initiatives focus on celebrating the 19th century and interwar suffragists. And if from later periods, those belonging to the anti-communist opposition in the Polish People's Republic, already mentioned as Women of Solidarity movement. The commemoration of the 100th anniversary of granting Polish women the right to vote coincided with the celebration of the 100th anniversary of Poland regaining independence. And this combination of actions for women's suffrage and for the country's independence was very strongly exposed. Sadly, for post-war left feminists, especially communist politicians, intellectuals, activists of women's organizations, there was not enough space on this map of celebrations. So reflections on the absence or rare presence of communist women and feminist projects of rewriting the national canon, reconstructing history of women and the women's movement, lead me to the question of theoretical self-awareness of contemporary feminist researchers. The first question is, do they, or we, take the effort of problematizing our choices of the subject of our research questions, narrative conventions, and description categories? And the second question, do they, or we, problematize the impact of our own cultural environment and historical moment on the nature of our own research, and thus on the role in our role in maintaining or questioning the status quo, including in particular the hegemony of the national paradigm? I ask these questions after Lefke Harders, the German theoretician of biography, who points out that the choice of the biographical research object, but also the choice of research questions, description categories, and narrative conventions is important for the legitimacy of this object and the history behind it, or rather the version of the past that biography reconstructs. Characters with a stable position in national memory are more likely to become heroes of biography and thus strengthen the current of memory within which the present canon is formed. According to Harders, this principle also applies to women who become the object of biographical research primarily when they live in the environment of great men, or as great women, they have a guaranteed place in the national history. Harders' remarks seem useful to describe feminist biographical, or more broadly, herstory practices. In feminist research, a critical analysis of the canon goes hand in hand with the creation of one's own, which, however, often falls within the dominant paradigm and maintains its duration. According to American historian Antoinette Burton, researchers of the past, especially the history of women and women's movements, which are particularly interesting for Burton, but also theoreticians who refer to history to find examples in support of their more generalizing statements, should be aware that they refer to the past reconstructed now, in a specific cultural environment, and above all in a specific historical moment. It is this moment that shapes the framework in which we decide who we will commemorate and whom we will leave outside the memory, what categories we will use to describe the subject of our research, what meanings we will give it. And material for rethinking these issues is provided by the scanty, full of gaps, yet fascinating biography of Zofia Dembińska. In the memory of France from her youth, she enrolled mainly as a wife of her husband and the right hand of her male boss. The husband was Henryk Dębiński, I will show you his picture in a second, who was first Catholic activist, then a leftist Marxist who approached communist circles in the mid-1930s, one of the main figures of the so-called young Vilnius left. The boss was Jerzy Borejsza, a pre- and post-war communist activist. In 1944, the founder of the publishing cooperative Czytelnik, The Reader, and the magazine Odrodzenie, Rebirth, but also initiator and Secretary General of the World Congress of Intellectuals in Defense of Peace in Wrocław in 1948. Dembińska herself was a pre-war teacher, after the war active in the field of publishing, education, and childcare, and as it's least known, women's rights. So far, she has not had an independent biography or even a biographical sketch highlighting various aspects of her activity. She was not captured on a collective portrait of the post-war Polish intelligentsia, nor did she hit the pages of Herstory. The story of her life and activism derives mainly from references, hints appearing in the memoirs of other people, but rarely recalls her own voice, texts, letters, interviews, public speeches. If Dembińska is worth of an interest, then more as a background for more important than her, especially men. But most often, she is not worth of interest, and I ask about the question for the reason of this. So Dembińska is interesting for me, first of all, as a member of a leftist political formation which took over power in Poland at the end of the Second World War. She's interesting as a participant in the process of socialist modernization of the country in the field of culture and education, but also as a civil servant who co-created the project of women's emancipation. And feminist biographies of women like Dembińska didn't arise on Polish soil yet. There are a few examples, including Magda's book, but they're very recent publications. On the other hand, the interest of biographers who do not identify with the feminist perspective is often expressed stereotypically, and the sexism of these narratives functions as an integral part of the anti-communist framework. That is why, secondly, Dembińska is interesting for me in the context of reflections on how to write about communist women today, by means of which conventions and narrative schemes within which memory and identity frameworks. But also, perhaps above all, I ask why these women, these communist women, are not written about today, why they are silenced, erased from the collective memory and history, and in particular, why feminist researchers are so silent about them. The same feminist researchers who have done so much to revise the national canon and broaden our view of the history of Poland and the role women played in it. Therefore, Dembińska appears in my research as a figure deserving of a feminist gesture of getting out of silence, but also as an impulse to reflect on the condition of feminist theory and biographical practice in Poland. And very briefly, who was Zofia Dembińska? So we know very little about her. The first period of her life, she was born in Warsaw in Westfalewicz family. Her father was very patriotic, fighting in Piłsudski's legions in the First World War and against Bolsheviks. She had two sisters who were Catholic nuns, and this is very interesting. She also had three brothers. The family was very Catholic, was very anti-communist and anti-Soviet, which was common at that time. I'm speaking about the interwar period. She studied Polish language and literature at Vilnius University, so she's like connected with this region, I would say, Polish before the Second World War, where she was initially associated with Catholic organizations. She also worked as a teacher in primary and high schools in the Vilnius region. Later, she became a member of the Young Vilnius Left, a Marxist intellectual movement which approached illegal Communist Party of Poland in the mid-1930s. So, thanks to the memoirs of her friends from the Vilnius period, Dembińska went down in history as a fiancée and later a wife of Henryk Dębiński. I will show you. So this is one of her sisters. I will go back to this, but I wanted to, so here we have her husband, Henryk Dębiński, and he's credited with introducing Zofia to leftist circles and making her a Marxist. Dembińska's biography seems impossible to tell without mentioning the life story of her husband, which was a tragic one. Dębiński was a political prisoner in the interwar Poland, but he was also a victim of the Nazis, murdered in 1941 at the territories of today's Belarus. Both Czesław Miłosz, you have him, a Polish poet, Nobel Prize winner, leftist and then anti-communist, but also the communist writers and activists like Jerzy Putrament. All of the friends of Dębiński's from Vilnius commemorated Zofia as a wife of Dębiński. Depending on their fate, post-war sympathies and antipathies, they wrote about her either as a fanatical communist, it was Miłosz, or as a competent official organizer of cultural life in post-war Poland. It was, for example, Putrament who called her like this. However, everyone primarily emphasized the private dimension of her life, that is her marriage with Dembiński, for whom she was supposed to be a beloved fiancée, then a faithful wife, and then a faithful widow. Putrament even wrote a novel, Reality, based on his, on which the film was directed and produced in 1960, telling the story of Henryk and his associates accused in 1937 of illegal communist activity, still here in Vilnius. And Zofia was portrayed in this movie as a teacher and above all as a supportive fiancée. An interesting ending of the story is very recently, 15 years ago, the liberal cultural journal Respublika Nowa reminded Zofia Dembińska by publishing the letters which Henryk wrote to her from prison in 1938. He called her there in these letters his inspiration, his friend, and the love of his life. However, the same journal didn't decide to include Zofia's replies to the husband's letters. What is really interesting, and I found out about it much later, that Zofia wasn't as, I don't know, dutiful or faithful widow. She remarried happily. She had another husband, but this is what the mythical story, the main narrative, doesn't even include. Interestingly, what happened after the war? So after the war, between 1944 and 1951, Dembińska was the vice president of the Czytelnik publishing cooperative, which was the first and for a long time the largest publishing company in post-war Poland. Contemporary historians, however, do not see her as an active organizer of the post-war cultural life, headed by the mission of spreading literature and reading, that is making literature cheap and easily accessible to the workers and peasants, but above all, they see in her the right hand of her boss, Jerzy Borejsza. This is the logo of Czytelnik, and this is Jerzy Borejsza in the middle, yeah, and this is also Dembińska. Eryk Krasucki, a Polish biographer of Borejsza, characterizes Dembińska as, quote, the person of the second plan, graciously attributing to her the publishing success of the cooperative. He calls her more systematic and orderly from Borejsza, and he says that she was more eager to efficiently implement his vision. So for contemporary historian, the division of roles is clear. Borejsza was a genius visionary, an artist. He was the president of the Czytelnik, and she was the director. And Dembińska was a systematic, orderly clerk, a craftswoman. This is despite the fact that Dembińska was the author of the mission statement of Czytelnik, as well as a representative of Czytelnik in various state bodies for culture, what she fought with other officials, politicians, and party activists for the accessibility of good literature to the masses. Next period is also interesting, but we know at least I know very little about it. Between 1951 and 1960, Dembińska worked as a deputy minister of education and childcare. And this period, we know quite a lot about this period from the memoirs of one of her co-workers, Bogdan Traczewski, but he depicts a very sentimental picture of Dembińska as a social activist, mainly interested in creating family orphanages, developing the school subject entitled Bringing Up a Family Life, caring for the development of families and the happiness of children in families. But maybe it was true for the 1970s and 80s when Dembińska co-worked with Traczewski in the Society for Children's Friends of Children. But what's missing on this picture is her activism as a deputy minister of education in the 50s, yes? So what do we know about Dembińska's activism in the 50s? First of all, thanks to several texts which I found, they show that her extraordinary commitment to creating a public school friendly to children, oriented to their proper intellectual, emotional, and physical development. In the mid-50s, she often spoke about the importance of sport in the children's development process, spoke about hygiene and the role of school in popularizing knowledge on this subject. So nothing about family, but a lot about public school open to all children. We know that Dembińska was also very active in the campaign for children's rights as a member on the International Forum, as a member of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. She signed and co-signed and was involved in preparing the Declaration of the Children's Rights, which was adopted in 1959. But it's very interesting to see how she functions, if she functions as a politician in Polish collective memory. It's rather this stereotypical image of the good teacher, good lady taking care of children, but not as a politician really involved in organizing the whole process of public education. The last thing I would like to say is about Dembińska's involvement in the fight for women's rights. This is interesting for our conference. So this topic is, I would say, quite unexamined. We know something. We know, for example, that Dembińska was among the creators of Przyjaciółka, a girlfriend, which was the first mass magazine for women, which began to appear in March 1948. We know that she was, in 1949, that she was a member of the board of the League of Polish Women. We know from the Polish Wikipedia, and she's mentioned, and that she was a member of this United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, but surprisingly active for the children's rights. So what about the women's rights? Yes, so thanks to already mentioned on the conference works of Franziska de Haan, Dutch historian, I learned quite a lot about this sphere of activism. We know that Franziska de Haan's very recent article brings real revelations about Dembińska, discussing the contribution of female politicians from socialist states to the advancement of women's rights in the post-war world. De Haan discovered Dembińska's significant role. In 1965, she was the main initiator and the author of the Declaration on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, so-called DIDO, adopted by the United Nations in 1967. A year later, she proposed to develop the declaration in a legally binding convention, but she didn't take any action in this direction. The works began only in 1972 and were completed in 1979. We know that Dembińska wasn't taking part in that, but however, De Haan underscores her great merits to initiate the whole process. The other thing very interesting, and was discovered by the historian Giussi Russo, who wrote that at the 12th meeting of the United Nations Women's Commission in 1958, Dembińska, together with a representative of France and the Dominican Republic, strongly demanded that the United Nations and the World Health Organization should take action against women's ritual mutilation in African countries. She encouraged the launch of a media campaign and emphasized that international institutions must intervene where individual governments are unable to, quote, remedy this repugnant act. According to Russo, this was the first case in history when the commissioner so empathically named practices detrimental to women. However, Dembińska subdued her position after the statement of the representative of the Soviet Union, which ruled that international organizations cannot speak on that matter without hearing the voices of women from countries in which such phenomena occur. So, I want to conclude. I'm sorry, probably I'm talking too long, but 3 things to conclude. So Dembińska, for sure, wasn't the most important or the most exceptional woman with leftist views active in the international area and acting for women's rights. And there were many such women. Their names were recalled and will be recalled today and tomorrow and the day after. They were representing various nationalities, and contemporary research slowly bring them out of silence. However, I must say that for me, she is a discovery. Why is she so important for my research? So first of all, Dembińska is one of those women who, following the reflections of the Chinese-American historian Wang Cheng, deserve to be found in the state. Wang Cheng wrote this brilliant book, Finding Women in the State, about Chinese communist women in the Mao era. So I think that Dembińska deserves to be found in the state because of her involvement in social and cultural changes in post-war Poland. She was one of the, how I call them, architects of the people's Poland, an activist who tied her hopes to change the position of people from lower classes, including women, with systemic change. Dembińska didn't belong to political elites. She acted through culture and education, which play a fundamental role in the policy of post-authorities. She was part of a generation of women, pre-war intellectuals, teachers, writers, publicists, and educational activists for whom the post-war reconstruction of the state was a tool for rebuilding society. Yes, why is she also important? She's also important because through her work we see that not only women involved in women's organizations were acting for women's rights. There were a lot of women, politicians, intellectuals, artists, writers, who were involved in this fight, yes? And Dembińska was one of them. However, she was also a member of the women's organization. Dembińska's international activism in the 50s and 60s undermines the recently popular thesis in Polish historical research that the progressive activism of women ended with the end of Stalinism, and all that came later was only a return to conservative principle. Dembińska shows that the progress-backlash dichotomy is not so simple and obvious. Her life story and activism revealed that in the post-Stalin era, the space for action changed. Conservative tendencies in the country didn't have to mean the same trend in the international era, where progressive activists found a field to act in the international institutions, implementing one of the key socialist and communist slogans, that is of inter and transnational cooperation. And finally, my last point, why is she so important? The example of Dembińska allows us not only to see how communist women are remembered in today's Poland, but also to go beyond the dominant national paradigm in the Polish scholarship. And this paradigm brings everything to the matters of the nation, identity, borders, and convinces that the key is only what was done in Poland and for Poland. The discovery of Dembińska, which happened thanks to international cooperation, shows how important is the transnational turn in historical research, that is indicating how people, ideas, organizations cross the borders of nation states to act for human rights, including the women's rights. This turn should challenge the feminist theory and biographical writing as well as historiography in Poland, however, probably not only there. It encourages to think rethink the subject of research, questions asked, categories of description used, but also to reach for new materials, often collected in foreign archives. It also reminds that the researchers' decision about how our production of knowledge about the past takes place has an impact on the role of this knowledge in the processes of understanding the present and shaping the future. And this is what feminist researchers have been claiming for a long time. Thank you, and I'm sorry I spoke so long. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for coming, even though you're a bit sick. The next presenter is Alexandra Delaware, and her title of the talk is Women Should Be Given the Right to Decide for Themselves, Decriminalization of Abortion in Soviet Union in 1955.
Okay, yeah. Good afternoon. Thank you a lot for organizing this event, and thank you for attending. And also thanks a lot to Magdalena and Agnieszka for your presentations. Because I feel that I don't need to articulate a lot of things now, and this is really great. So my presentation is part of my PhD research project, and I will present only one case out of many others that I'm going to explore while my PhD, and today it's decriminalization of abortion in the Soviet Union. And the main questions for today's presentation is a way for me to find how to analyze and how to speak about women's agency back in Soviet Union, because as it was discussed, it is like women's agency under state socialism, at least in Russia and in many other Eastern European countries, is denied by many scholars, but also it would be simplification to say that, oh, they had agency, that's it. because it's an opportunity to do certain things and also not to do certain things. It's about possibilities and limitations. That's why today I will try to explore how the story about decriminalization of abortion in the Soviet Union in 1955 helps us to think about kind of subjectivity that was enabled by Soviet discourse on gender equality and by Soviet, like this hegemonic politics of the party and the Soviet government, what opportunities it created for women and what limitations it also implied. So, brief history of abortion legislation in the Soviet Union. As it was mentioned today, it was decriminalized in 1920s by a decree on women's health care. And here you can see the quote from the legislation. And in bold, you can see that the abortion and legalization of abortion, both on medical and social grounds, was explained by the fact of poor economic condition of the country at that particular moment, and the fact that abortion was necessary evil of Tsarist time because of class exploitation and working conditions of poor working and peasant women, and that actually abortion is framed as a protection of motherhood and childhood. Then in 1936, it was criminalized again and again as a protection of motherhood and childhood. And now it was explained that because Soviet Union reached that level of economical and social development, abortion is not needed anymore. Soviet women are educated enough, and aware, or like their conscience are high enough to be able to give birth to a new generation of Soviet people, and also economic conditions allow it. What is more important regarding these two laws that by scholars they are regarded as the pro-natalist measures of the Soviet Union, both of them, legalization of abortion and criminalization of abortion. And my legislation is also regarded as another one pro-natalist measure, which is definitely simplification, because it's strange that government would change that, oh, we need more legal abortion, or we need to criminalize abortion for improvement of demographic situation. Moreover, what is important, if we look into the discussions about this legislation, we can see that it was all framed in medical terms. So the main issue was women's health and health of children, and not the actual growth or decrease of population. And in 1955, legislation on the abolition of the prohibition of abortion, as you can see, takes this rationale of previous legislation regarding abortion one step further, and it argues that in 50s, Soviet women are even more educated and aware, so that can now decide whether they need or don't need an abortion. In that sense, it looks like it's just continuation of this Soviet government hesitation whether abortion should be legal or not for demographic interest of the country. However, if we look behind this particular legislation, we can obviously see that situation was much more complicated. So a bit of background. What is happening in after the Second World War in Soviet Union and mostly in Soviet Russia, obviously, I'm speaking about it. And yeah, so in 1944, the law on increasing government support for pregnant women, mothers with many children, single mothers, and strengthening protection of motherhood and childhood was published. And what is important to mention that this law was actually drafted by Nikita Khrushchev. I guess some of you heard about this guy who was the who usually gets all the credits for decriminalization of abortion in the Soviet Union as a part of liberalization of the Soviet Union, so-called SAW. So he actually drafted this particular law, which was which is famous for its bitter effect on women due to its unofficial goal, which was articulated in a supplementary note for this law, to increase number of out-of-wedlock children. That was considered to be the only solution for after-war gender imbalance, particularly the fact that majority of male population died during the war, and also to increase birth rates. So this law actually introduced category of single mother. According to this law, children born outside of wedlock were not allowed to have any actual father. So the father line in their birth certificate should have left blank, empty, which meant that a man could go and produce as many children as they want without any type of economic or legal consequences for them. And this law also made divorce procedure even more difficult. So if a couple wanted to have a divorce, they had to go and publish announcement that they are going to divorce in their local newspaper. Then they have to go to the court, etc. So initially the point was that divorce was almost impossible, but also men had no responsibility for children born outside their legal marriage. And they would go and make as many children as they only can. And this also, but not only, I mean, this was initial intention, yeah, but it would be too cruel, so they extended definitely support for single mothers that were created as a category through this particular law, right? Because before in the Soviet Union, all the children had an official right to claim for payments from their fathers, whether they were born inside official marriage or outside official marriage, right? With this law, no, so the government was supporting women more. That's why the law is called on increasing governmental support for pregnant women, yes, whereas it was doing the opposite. So with this law, unfortunately, the growth of, despite the expectations of the government, it neither brought the substantial growth of the birth rate nor a decrease in illegal abortions. And as you can see on this slide, the data on illegal abortions as well as deaths from illegal abortions were quite high in the Soviet Union after the Second World War. And numerous intergovernmental commissions were established in order to explore why it's happening and how to fix that situation. And my main heroine of today's presentation, Maria Kovrygiina, I will talk a bit more about her later, but that's her quote that I use as a title of my PhD project and of this presentation. She was part of all these interministerial, intergovernmental commissions that were dealing with the abortions and high rates of illegal abortions, and she was trying to promote that abortion should be, at least the criteria for legal abortion should be expanded on both social and economic grounds, and there were certain slow changes due to the work of these commissions. These commissions, what they did, they, for example, did surveys in hospitals where women who suffered from some diseases that they got in a result of illegal abortion were. They made surveys there asking those women, why did you do illegal abortion? And Kovrygiina, for instance, she also kind of faked this data, saying that majority of women, for example, they did it because of poor social economic conditions. Obviously, it's after war years. But she added to this point also bad relationship with their partners and family, so that there is no way to say, okay, it will get better, and this woman will be able to continue living without legalization of abortion. She said that no, it's not only economic problem, it's also problems with their partners and family that made them do these abortions. And as for Maria Kovrygiina, and it's in a way a continuation of what Agnieszka was talking, these are on the slide 3 excellent books on women's history or gender politics in the Soviet Union, and none of them ever mentioned Maria Kovrygiina, Nina Popova, or Nona Muravyova. those three women who actually brought this law into government and into life. So yeah, as you can see, it's Maria Kovrígina. She was at the moment when the abortion was decriminalized in the Soviet Union, she was the Minister of Healthcare of the Soviet Union. Nina Popova, who was also mentioned today, and she was the head of the Soviet Women's Committee organization. I will talk about it a bit later, and also secretary of the All-Union Central Council of Trade Unions, and Nona Muravyova, Minister of Welfare of the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic. And those three women, they were part of final commission that drafted the final law for the Soviet government. Moreover, Nina Popova mentioned that she, with Maria Kovrígina, brought the law, the draft of the law, to the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union. And what I want to emphasize here, that those three women, as you can see from their short biographies, were connected through the Soviet Women's Committee. Soviet Women's Committee is initially Soviet Women's Anti-Fascist Committee. That was an organization that was established in Soviet Union in 1941 for the international propaganda of socialism, and it is considered a puppet of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And that's true, partly. This organization made a lot for international propaganda of Soviet Union, of socialism, and achievements of Soviet Union in the field of gender equality. But what I'm interested that as a way to, that the whole discourse on gender equality and this whole organizational platform, it enabled certain type of identities that might not have been created otherwise. So for example, first of all, it united all these women from political elite. So in Soviet Union, it was important to promote sort of gender mainstreaming and promote women to higher political positions. And this organization united those women who were part of ministerial or like federal or also all union levels. So they were, that's how they could have been introduced to each other even though they didn't work together. And as a participant of different international delegations, they also were able to have an access and actually become a part of transnational feminist movement. So, for example, as a case, today I will discuss Maria Kovrígina's biography, which is briefly described on the slide. As you can see, she has typical Soviet biography. She's from peasant family. Her elder brothers joined Bolshevik parties during the Civil War. Then she got an education, started work as a manager mainly, and party organizer from early pioneer years. And then during the Second World War, because she was from Ural region, which is in the central Russia, lots of hospitals were evacuated to this area. So she was actually managing lots of hospitals and patients from front, as well as just from the whole part of the Soviet Union that was already in either under occupation or fighting against Nazi invasion. That's why she was going to Moscow from time to time, and in 1942 she was invited to the position of Vice Minister of Healthcare of the Soviet Union. She tried to avoid this position, and it's interesting part of this all biographies that they were invited to these positions. Those women would say, no, 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 I'm not knowledgeable enough, I'm not capable of doing this huge work. So they have these typical signs of imposter syndrome, and then the Central Committee would, no, you will do it anyways. Whether you want or not, you go, you do your ministerial job. So that's how she became a minister, and interesting enough, when she was a minister of the Russian Republic, she actually quitted her job because she thought that she's too stupid. And then, literally, there is her note to the Central Committee saying, I have to be more educated. And then she was invited to take a position of a Minister of Healthcare of the Soviet Union, which is quite interesting. So, she was, so she had this bright political career. She's typical bureaucrat, right? From peasant background, and then she was removed from the post of the Minister of Healthcare, and I don't know yet why, according to her own autobiography and her biographers, because she was too straightforward and too critical about ecological consequences of industrialization in the Soviet Union, and she was quite loud about that during gatherings of Supreme Soviet and other official gatherings, and it was annoying, so she got another high administrative position in the Institute for Continuing Education of Medical Personnel, also very important institute, but you can feel the difference between minister and just the head of some educational institution. So, and the interesting and intriguing part for me is how the woman who has this typical Soviet biography came up with all these phrases that you can see on the slide that her arguments during the discussions on decriminalization or on expansion of legal criteria for abortion in the Soviet Union. For example, why isn't the husband held responsibility for abortion? We must let women to decide for themselves, and we should not transform women into being the total into a being that only gives birth. And interesting enough, in her memoirs that she wrote in 1980s, she dedicates the whole chapter to decriminalization of abortion, in which she precisely discusses how it's important to give women rights to decide over their bodies and autonomy, etc. So all these discourse that cannot be seen as a logical part or continuation of official Bolshevik language. And on the lower part of the slide, you can see the picture of the USSR delegation to one of the congresses of Women's International Democratic Federations. So, and Maria Kovregina was actually the part of Soviet delegation to the very first establishing Congress of this Women's International Democratic Federation in 1945. And also in her archive, she kept the manifest, which was to all women of the world, which was published in the result of Budapest Congress of Women's International Democratic Federation. And the very fact that this material is present in her archive, that she gave to the, not she, but her daughter gave to the state archive only after the death of Kovregina, so she kept this in her archive for 50 years. It means that it meant something to her, right? That it probably, at the end, that was a source of this, in a way, foreign, or maybe not at least that logical parts of speaking Bolshevik and of Soviet discourse on gender politics. So at the end, I would just to sum up with these three almost random quotes, but actually not. So the question is that that was the point of my presentation. So how this idea of moral superiority of socialism, which was translated into very active participation of the Soviet Union on the international level in all the events regarding women's rights and gender equality, as was mentioned before, for example, CEDAW, DIDO, different events of United Nations, where in a way, women from the Soviet Union were sent in a way against their own will, right? They were not like claiming, oh, I'm the main feminist here. I want to go and meet another feminist from all around the globe. Soviet Union did it for so-called propaganda of socialism. And how did that inform and actually transformed so-called speaking Bolshevik, which Stefan Kotkin discusses as the ways of speaking about oneself that came to be refracted through the inescapable political lens of Bolshevism. So how they integrated these discourses and these problems into official Soviet discourse and into their political practice. And at the end, it could be helpful to think about it as a politics of concealment, the term introduced by Van Cheng, meaning, who already was mentioned here, meaning camouflaging actually different from the official agenda into with dominant party language. And this is maybe the space where the actual agency happened. That's it. Thank you.
I understand that I'm quite a bad moderator because I'm biased. I'm a historian. I'm sorry for that, but it's so interesting. And now, Agnieszka Mrozik will present, and her talk is called Multiplied Burdens of Honorable Duty, Women's Work in Soviet Lithuania, 1985-1988.
Sorry, I didn't print, but I have an excuse. I was organizing this conference. Where is this? Okay. So yes, I'm gonna talk about later period of Soviet Union, which is, as we probably know as historians, a very different, or I'm not a historian, but the historians would know that is very different from other other periods, because Perestroika was a lot about democratization and transparency, kind of releasing this censorship and so on. But I will talk. I will talk about actually women's councils during this perestroika in Soviet Lithuania, and I actually did my research on very local level. So it was actually about Kaunas factories and how women's councils were functioning there. What was their approach towards organizing and taking care of women workers, and also kind of complying to the main party line, or Gorbachev's politics, family politics. So first of all, the history of women's councils. So it's also called Zhensovieti in shortened form, and it was kind of established under Nikita Khrushchev. But then Zhensovieti were formed in factories and offices and on farms, also on regional levels, territory and district levels of administration. So their sizes varied from 30 members to 15 members. Also, it says here, this is like from the encyclopedia, but I don't think it's so, we can so simplify that and say that, Zhensovieti continued to exist on paper in the years of Leonid Brezhnev's. I don't have this knowledge to tell more about Brezhnev's times and women's council, so I cannot, it's a bit of generalization, I think. And so basically what was I got interested in because of this in perestroika time, because exactly Gorbachev was perceived as the one who revived and restructured women's councils, and he kind of stated that women's problems are society's problems. Soviet society have problems because women have problems.
but also the women that became active in women's councils, the number of women really increased in numbers. So we see the numbers in the spring 1988. And historian Żenia Browning, who analyzed and was researching the Żensowiety, activities of Żensowiety, categorizes the main functions of women's councils in four main sections of their activity. So mass work, ideological and moral education of women, improving living and working conditions, strengthening the family, and raising its role in the education of younger generation. Now, my point in this research was, my main interest was how women councils were trying to actually diverge from this main family politics and kind of try to improve the working conditions of women in the factories. Because they were allowed now to do it, kind of, that was the statement, that women's councils have to take care of their, of the workplaces and of the families and so on. So I think the main kind of obstacle, as it always was I think, so through all time of Soviet Union. So the reactivation and expansion of Żensowiety, or women's councils, during perestroika in Soviet Union were met with a passive resistance from other organizations led by men in the workplaces. So the indifference existed to women's organizing at workplaces, and it remained intact within the trade unions, the Soviets, and the main Communist Party through the 80s. Okay, so I'll try to be fast. So in my research, I'm asking what kind of mediation platform was women's councils in the factories of Soviet Lithuania during perestroika? Was it the organization that only had to mediate between the family and the state? Did women oppose the functions they were assigned to do in women's councils during perestroika? So I actually analyzed, and I kind of tried to work as a true historian and go through in the archives. And I analyzed the minutes of women's council meetings of several textile factories in Kaunas. It was Kaunas Šiaučiūnaitė Knitwear Industrial Enterprise, which I call further Knitwear Enterprise, Footwear Factory, Red October, later I will refer it as a footwear factory, and May 1st Knitwear Factory. So, to imagine, yeah, as I already mentioned what kind of the main functions of the women's councils were, for example, there were 4 commissions usually who were on a factory level, and the commissions were called the Commission of Aesthetics and Household Culture, the Commission of Political, Mass and Cultural Work, the Children and Youth Upbringing Commission, and the Commission of Women's Work, Rights and Health Protection. So these different commissions had different functions, had their own chairpersons, and basically they basically overlapped in the factory, and sometimes, as we will see, sometimes they just focused on one commission work, or the women were only doing work in the one commission, not disregarding the other commissions. So I concentrated on the activities of women's councils in the textile factories, but also I analyzed the articles of Tarybinė moteris, Soviet woman, which is also, I found, very important in relation how they approached women's work and workers' rights. Yes. So I'll start from the Soviet woman, Sovietinė moteris. So in 1986, Tarybinė moteris magazine published an interview with Irena Poltanavičienė. She's, I don't know if you see it, she's a second from my side, on the right, from the right. So she was the head of women's councils in Soviet Lithuania, and she was interviewed by the main editor of the magazine, Tarybinė moteris, and while asked about women working heavy manual work, often under harsh conditions, Poltanavičienė answered that it is still a big issue, but by 1990, it is planned to put an end to the hard physical work of women. So Poltanavičienė was also the secretary of All Unions Council of Soviet Lithuania. She was kind of the one who should have known the problems women had to experience in their workplace. So, but nevertheless, while answering the question about women's working conditions, she adds at the end, and we see the quote here, no matter what we would talk and what we would do in this area, there is a human beside the machinery and mechanisms. His role, dedication, honesty, in many cases determine everything and are very closely related to such a sore quality of production problem. Therefore, the role of human factor, the human factor is very important, is one of the most important. This is something our female producers must understand as well. So this human factor that the head of Women's Councils talks about was present in every speech and public discourse of perestroika. The human factor is mainly related, as I would say, I would interpret it with the discipline of workers. As Poltanavičienė emphasized, first goes the discipline and quality of the product, and only then the conditions of the worker. So during perestroika, the discipline of workers was creatively attached to the strong role of the family. In her next question for Poltanavičienė, the main editor of the Tarybinė moteris refers to Gorbachev, who at the 27th Communist Party Summit emphasized the strengthening of the family with the help of the women's councils. So regarding the work of women's councils, during the changing times, Poltanavičienė responded that at the moment it is also necessary of them, women's councils, to focus on the family as much as possible, increasing parental responsibility for upbringing of their children. So we see that there is a strong discourse of how the family should be treated. I will skip some of this. And, but there are examples that kind of contradicts to this assigned formal discourse for women. And in one women's council meeting on November 1986 of the same knitwear enterprise, the chairwoman stated that the situation with the Commission of Women's Work, Rights and Health Security is worse than with the Commission dealing with children of workers or the Commission responsible for organizing festivities and events. So the reason I emphasize this remark is that the tone and direction of discussions, for example, in Tarybinė moteris about women's working conditions changed kind of radically from 1986. From then on, The journal frequently discussed women's health protection issues and seriously considered the harmful conditions as they appeared in the factories. Although every women's council on the factory level had the commissions that they are responsible for voluntary inspection of women's working conditions, but there are almost, or at least I didn't find, almost no considerations or reports on issues of working conditions in the actual minutes of the Women's Council's meetings in Kaunas factories that I have studied. So in general, it could seem like that the expanded discussion and critique of women's workers' situation during the years of perestroika could be only visible in Tarybinė Moteris magazine. The meetings and the activities of women's councils in the factories that I have studied were kind of happening in the same manner as if kind of nothing has changed. But I'll explain the reasons, what could be the reasons for that. And so I'll give one example. Yes, let's skip this. So I'll just give one example of this one Tarybinė Moteris article where the women from the women's councils met with the directors of factories, including the representative of Soviet labor inspection and jurists from the construction company. And the discussion started from the statistics of women working under the harsh conditions. As the inspector enumerated, the overtime, the night shifts, work on weekends, and double shifts are the main infringements of the labor legislation. So the chairpersons of the women's councils assured that they supervise the working conditions of women and try to negotiate with the managers about the violations in the workplace, but the results depended a lot on the attitude of administration towards their workers. So we see that, like, these relations are the kind of the key point of how women's councils activities were happening and developing. So the chairperson of Women's Council in Panemunė district of Kaunas pushed even further for assuring the improvement of working conditions. So this is the quote from her, saying that the chairperson of women's councils must prove to be worthy of duty entrusted to her to fight for women's affairs. In my opinion, she says, the chairperson of the council has to be included as a member in the unions committee. So the deputy of the other women's council from Panevėžys reports that their women's council works well with the administration, therefore they have quite good conditions in the sewing factory. They do not have night shifts, women having small children work less hours, some have shorter working weeks. Also, they have work breaks where they exercise and do hand massages. So it seems that the relation between the improvement of women's working conditions and the role of women's councils was kind of very closely knit. And the study of labor legislation and the provision of labor code infringements were a significant part of some women's councils. However, not all of them were heard by the administration. So what were the reasons behind the divergent outlook and impact of women's social initiatives at the workplaces? Apart from the important constellation of the relation between the factory management, trade union, and party, the Women's Council's activities were determined, as I would state, also by the status of women. So women as a worker, it very much depended on where she stands at the factory. Either she is in good relations with the administration, it also depends on her position in the factory. How long do I have? Okay. Okay, so when reading the minutes of Women's Council meeting at May 1st Knitwear Factory, the relations between the Women's Council and other social organizations in the factory can appear opaque. The meeting was attended by 102 persons, including the director of the factory, the secretary of the party, and the chairman of trade union committee. Nevertheless, considering the amount of the participants, the minutes are pretty short. Some speeches are reported and added separately, such as a speech of a chairwoman of the Women's Council. I'll be very quick. Also, some of the workers spoke up, and the first was the head of the one workshop level Women's Council. She claimed that women are not quite satisfied with the buffet's work, the lunches are of insufficient quality, the food menu is rather scarce. Another worker, the knitting workshop instructor, emphasized the poor situation of family dormitories. The May 1st factory used to share the dormitory with the cotton spinning factory. So the owner of the dormitory, the spinning factory, the cotton spinning factory, wants to take the dormitory back and do not share with this factory. So the worker was worried and urged to take all possible measures in order to at least ensure the same amount of family dormitories they had at the time, although the workers admitted it was far from satisfying their needs. The last speech was made by the deputy of trade union chairperson. So she advised the Women's Council to be active at strengthening the family, promoting a sober and healthy lifestyle, not only at work, but also in the family. And in order to do it, more events and sport festivities were needed. So at the end of the minutes, the resolution was made along the lines of the last speech, while the problems of food at the buffet and dormitories were not mentioned at all, even in the abstract or vague way. So first, in the end, it seems that Women's Council in the main first factory could develop only the activities that were related to the traditional gender roles. And this limited and gender scope of activities can be illustrated by already mentioned interview in Tarybinė Moteris magazine with the head of all Women's Council, Paltanavičienė, where she claims that our women's councils have developed a wide range of activities. Perhaps I would not have seen any city or district work collective where women's councils would not give their tribute to organizing various events, fostering the beauty of the environment, developing good traditions. So it's also, there is a kind of I also analyzed this other footwear factory minutes, and it's kind of also reflects the same pattern where like the organization, the Women's Council are organizing Young Workers' Day, celebration without alcohol, what is it like, and similar events. Okay, so the conclusions. There is also I think it's very important event in the history as well. There was the summit of Soviet Lithuania women, but I will skip that also, just to see what was the resolution of Soviet Lithuania Women's Summit. And so they kind of wanted to draw the lines how women's councils should develop their activities, and that's the kind of framing of their activities. So I tried to delineate a variety of possibilities and issues that women in the women's councils could promote. I wanted to show that women's councils did not act under one pragmatic party line, but they're more or less dependent on the relation in the workplace with the union and administration in choosing specific methods and focus. As the Women's Council in the knitwear factory enterprise in Kaunas once concentrated more on the family issues, the upbringing of the youth, other councils, as from the articles in Sovietinė Moteris, in different factories, we saw that they are also concentrated more on the workplace issues, as well as the health of women's workers, and finally on the various events for workers and their children. Nevertheless, on the 27th Summit of Communist Party in 1986, the doctrine that family issues constitute a major problem of Soviet society as well was announced, and the responsibility for taking care of family issues was without questions attributed to women. So the division of domestic labor was rarely questioned publicly, nor it was questioned in the internal documents of women's councils, which I analyzed. So sometimes, as pointed out in one meeting minutes, women, while being single mothers, were punished for handling everything on their own terms. Yes, there was also this dimension of blaming single mothers not taking care of their children. First, the activities of women's councils depended on the relations among the factory organizations. For instance, trade union officials could have prevented the women's councils to do certain activities. Second, the social status of women in women's councils has determined its possibilities and limits because the level of education was directly convertible to the employment position in the workplace, therefore gaining more or less authority. So these 2 points that I wanted to make. That's it.